what a great pleasure it is for us to introduce Dr. Hussey.
Thanks, guys. A little bit about, my story. I've been told I'm predisposed to heart disease pretty heavily because I'm type 1 diabetic. I've been told that my whole life. And so I started investigating, the cardiovascular system a long time ago. And I've learned a lot of things about it, and it has taught me a lot of things. And so about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, someone asked me the question, why is heart cancer so rare? And I thought, you don't really hear about it that much, cancer of the heart. It definitely happens, but it's pretty rare. And so I thought about that, looked into it, and found some answers, which we're going to talk about today. But someone else asked me a while after that, why do we care? It's rare. The body seems to have it under control. Why should we care about that? And I would say that it seems to me that the heart is kind of laying this template of how to prevent cancer. So maybe we should pay attention to that and try and emulate the rest of or put our body in that environment and create that in the rest of our body. So kind of listen to your heart a little bit. So what do you say we listen to our hearts and learn some things about how to prevent cancer? Sound good? Okay. So just some stats first, just to kind of get a reference of how rare it actually is. The vast majority of tumors originating in the heart are benign. So not malignant, not aggressive tumors, they're benign tumors. One study found that of 12,000 heart cancer cases, 7 were primary cardiac tumors. So it's extremely rare that if cancer of the heart does happen, that it originates in the heart, that the primary spot where it originates is in the heart. One doctor, Robert Cusimano, is a cardiac surgeon. He's the closest thing that we kind of have to a cardiac oncologist. And he only sees about 12 cases per year, which is just showing how rare that is. Primary cardiac tumors are 0.3 to 0.7% of all cardiac tumors. So again, very rare for cancer to originate in the heart. It's way more likely that you get cancer somewhere else and it metastasizes to the heart. However, when they are malignant, the survival rate at 9 to 12 months is only 10%. So they are pretty detrimental when they do happen. So there are 2 reasons why I think heart cancer is rare. And I did a talk for KetoCon 2020 online, because everything was online that year, talking about the more metabolic and biochemistry reasons why heart cancer is so rare. And we're going to touch on those today, but there's more in depth to that. It's on my YouTube channel. You can check that out. But that's more metabolic theory of cancer and what I call metabolic heart attacks, which are heart attacks that happen with no blockage whatsoever. But then today we're really going to focus on this idea of biophysics. And it's what I love about this question of why heart cancer is so rare. So it leads us into biophysics, which is something I think that is neglected a bit sometimes. We talk about biochemistry a lot because of nutrition and pharmaceuticals and supplements and things like that, and that's biochemistry. But we're going to talk about biophysics, which I think is really important. So think cells, gels, and electromagnetism. So just to touch and give you kind of a base for the metabolic reasons, we've all heard of this metabolic theory of cancer. And what's happening in the metabolic theory of cancer is that normally our body takes glucose or fats or ketones and uses them with oxygen to make energy, okay, to make ATP. And that's called oxidative phosphorylation, when we use oxygen to make energy. And this process makes up a large portion of how our body makes ATP, 89% of how our cells make ATP. And it makes about 36 ATP. But using fat and ketones, there's evidence that we make more ATP from using those. So keep that in mind. However, in cancer, what we see is that the cell shifts over from using oxygen to a process that doesn't use oxygen. It's called anaerobic, no oxygen respiration. It's also called glycolysis or fermentation. And this process uses a lot of glucose, which is why you can do a DEXA scan with radioactive glucose and see where cancer is, because the cancer's uptaking the glucose. But it makes very little ATP. So cancer cells have to use a lot of glucose trying to maintain life. And so the question is, why does this not happen in heart tissue? Why does this transition not happen? Why do we not see this? So the short answer for this talk, like again, the other talk I gave a much longer answer, but the short answer is that a division deficiency. So heart cells can't divide. Okay, so if in our cells over here, the mitochondria would allow us to use oxygen. Remember, oxygen is incredibly important for that oxidative phosphorylation. And so if the mitochondria become damaged and the cell can't use oxygen, it reverts over to that fermentation, trying to make enough energy. And the thing is that heart cells can't divide. And so if they lose the ability to use oxygen, they don't become these rapidly dividing cancer cells, because so if they lose the ability to lose oxygen, they can't do that, and they die instead. Okay, but there are things that even prevent that from happening. And so the reason that heart cells can't divide is thought to because they're so metabolically active. The heart cells are constantly contracting, using a lot of energy, and it also takes a lot of energy to divide a cell. And so it's like this trade-off that the heart cells had. If we want to be able to, constantly be using ATP and contracting, we've got to lose the ability to divide. And so Warburg, one of the fathers of the metabolic theory of cancer, said that cells that die can never become tumorigenic. So when heart cells get to a situation where they can't use oxygen because mitochondria are damaged, which is a rare thing that happens, they would die rather than become rapidly dividing undifferentiated cells like cancer. The other reason is that there seems to be this preference for ketones and fatty acids in heart tissue, even in the presence of glucose. So usually in our bodies, we have to restrict glucose. That's what the ketogenic diet is. We restrict carbohydrates. We get our body burning fats and making ketones, but we have to restrict the glucose. However, there's lots of studies that even in the presence of glucose, the heart cells will choose to burn fatty acids and ketones. And to me, this gives us an advantage, because remember that cancer is when cells go from this oxidative phosphorylation, not to using oxygen, to not being able to use oxygen and going into fermentation. And ketones and fatty acids are fuels that cannot ferment. So if its preference is ketones and fatty acids, then it'll never go into fermentation, or it's less likely to go into fermentation. Does that make sense? So that's the kind of the base metabolic reasons why. So now let's go into these biophysics and quantum side of things. And what I mean by this is light, energy, electromagnetism, things like that, the physics of our body. So to preface this, we have to talk about water. We're all told that we are a large percentage water, right? And that makes up the majority of our body. People say anywhere from 60 to, I've heard 85% water. But I don't slosh around like a waterbed, do I? And I'm pretty sure you guys don't either. So if I was liquid water, if I did a quick motion over like that, I'd feel water slosh over this way. But I don't feel that. It's because most of the water in my body is in a gel state. It's more of a solid state. Think Jello. Like if I grab the tissue of my forearm, it feels like Jello. I can manipulate it and move it, but it goes right back, right? So I am in a gel state, or most of the water in my body is in a gel state. And that is what has been called structured water, or fourth phase water, or exclusion zone water. Lots of different names for it for different reasons. But this is the phenomenon that water, which is what we're largely made up of, can actually structure itself onto biological surfaces. So what do I mean by that? So if we look at a water molecule, H2O, what happens if water has a biological surface, or a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, and it has radiant energy, so the water is energized. It will cleave off one of the hydrogens, and so it'll just be an oxygen and a hydrogen. And those oxygens and hydrogens will team up, and they'll form this lattice-like structure, and that'll keep going, kind of like think of like a fence panel, an indefinite fence panel. So on this hydrophilic structure, or on this hydrophilic surface, the water starts to do this and form itself. And this is like a gel. It forms into more of like a gel, okay? So this is what's happening in our body, and I'm going to show you how. So in our cells, if people are familiar with cellular physiology, they know that there's this distribution of what are called ionic minerals in the cell. So we get this concentration of sodium outside the cell and a concentration of potassium inside the cell. And the reason that fourth phase water is also called exclusion zone water is because it tends to exclude anything that's not it, right? Except for small hydrated ions. And so the cutoff point for what's excluded and what's not as far as ions is right here at sodium potassium. It's called this Hofmeister series. And so you can imagine that that plays a key role into why we see this distribution of normal healthy cells of ions in and out of the cell. Now, so we must think that there's fourth phase water or exclusion zone water inside the cell and not so much outside the cell, because the potassium is small enough to get in and the sodium is not, and so it stays out. Okay, now, so remember, to make fourth phase water, we need water, obviously, and we need a hydrophilic surface, and we need radiant energy. So where does that hydrophilic surface come from inside a cell? And that is the microtrabecular lattice, which is a big word, but all it means is that there's proteins in the cell, and it's collagen, connective tissue, fascia, the things that hold us together, penetrates all the way down into the level of the nucleus and all the way out into tissues. It's literally this cobweb-like thing that holds us all together. And inside the cells, it's vast enough, or there's enough of it, that there's enough surface area for almost the entire amount of water, cytoplasm inside the cell, to be structured, to be in this gel state, which ends up with me being a gel, right? So, the reason that the fascia is everywhere, it's inside the cell, outside the cell. The reason that inside the cell it's more structured, there's more surface area, is because proteins can unfold. And the key to them unfolding is making ATP. So I'm going to break right there and say, what makes more ATP? Oxidative phosphorylation, using the ketones and fatty acids and using oxygen to make fuel makes more ATP. When our cells go over to fermentation in a more of a cancerous pathway, they lose the ability to use oxygen, they make less ATP. And when there's less ATP, what happens is proteins are usually folded up like this. And so you can see that when they're folded up, you know, these areas in the middle there's no access to them, right? The only access is to the things on the outside. ATP comes in, and one thing that it does in the cell, I think the main thing that it does in the cell, is it unfolds proteins, and it creates a lot of surface area. So when that happens, water has a lot of surfaces to form structured water on. And so when we make adequate ATP in our cells, then this happens, and we form structured water. So I want to put this all together for you, because that may have sounded like a lot. So we have, forget about this guy for a second. He's the damaged mitochondria. When we have healthy mitochondria, our body can take the chemical bonds from food, use oxygen, and make ATP, okay? When that happens, that ATP can go and unfold these proteins in the cell, creating lots of surface area for water, cytoplasm, which is the water in the cell, to create structured water in the cell. And so we get this cell that acts more like it seems more like a gel. And that is what creates this nice, evenly spaced tissue, this healthy tissue, okay? It's what's responsible for that ion distribution, the sodium outside the cell, the potassium inside the cell. And the thing that's important about that is you see that the inside of the cell is more negative. And that's because of the proteins. The proteins are a very electronegative thing. And so, you know, like charges repel each other. So the cells don't want to get too close together because they're very negatively charged. But they are attracted to this positive space in between, this sodium space, right? So what happens is they kind of get attracted to each other, or to the positive space, but they get too close to another cell that's negative, and they kind of go, okay. And so everybody finds their nice spot, and everybody's evenly distributed like that, okay? So let's play a different pathway. So let's do it again and say, now we have a damaged mitochondria, okay? And this is a mitochondria that are cells that are now not able to take those chemical bonds from food, use oxygen, and make ATP. We're converting over to fermentation because the body's trying, or the cells are trying to stay alive. And so when they do that, we go to fermentation, which makes way less ATP. We can't use ketones and fatty acids; those are non-fermentable fuel sources. And so the body uses glucose, which is really inefficient. And we make less ATP, so we don't get unfolding of proteins. ATP can't do that. We don't get this big network of surface area for fourth phase water to form. We don't get structured water in the cell. And instead, we get a tissue that's more clumped together, right? It's hard. It's not in a gel state anymore. That's a tumor, okay? So we can, and if a tumor was superficial enough, we could feel that. We could feel the change in tissue, and people report that, okay? So, again, Otto Warburg, he won the Nobel Prize back in 1929, He said the irreversible injury of respiration, remember using oxygen, is followed as the second phase of cancer formation by a long struggle for existence by the injured cells to maintain their structure. So that's what we're talking about. Structured water maintains the structure and tissue integrity. And if it loses the ability to use oxygen through that mitochondrial damage, then what Otto Warburg noticed a long time ago, back in the 20s, was that the cancer cells lose their structure. So, mitochondria are the reason why heart cells rarely go down that path. Okay, so the heart tissue is one of the densest with mitochondria, about 5,000 per cell, which is an astronomical amount. Some cells only have about 100 or so. So 5,000 is huge. Heart muscle tissue prefers fatty acids and ketones, remember, which makes it less likely to ever go into fermentation. The presence of ketones has been shown to increase mitochondrial respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, by 128%. So that's how important having metabolic flexibility is and being able to use ketones and fatty acids readily, especially for the heart. However, one thing I want to point out is that food is only about 1/3 of how mitochondria get electrons. And electrons are how the mitochondria produce ATP. There are many ways to optimize your mitochondria. So I'm going to explain this statement of don't let your electron transport chains get stretched out. So in this healthy mitochondria over there, on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, they have a thing called an electron transport chain. And all you need to know about that is that it transports electrons, just like the name says. And so these electrons we can get from food, from breaking down the chemical bonds in food and getting electrons. But we can also get them from our environment. We can soak them up directly from the earth. We can get them from sunlight, which we're going to talk about later. But the health of the mitochondria is dependent on those electrons to be passed down these proteins, pass the electrons down here and make water and ATP at the end of that. They want to get passed down. And so if we have adequate structured water in our bodies, energized water that's able to structure itself, then these proteins in the mitochondria and electron transport chain stay close enough together that electrons can hop down that line. Okay, if we lose structured water, now it's interesting because structured water is more dense, so it's more compact, and liquid water is more expansive. So if we start to get more liquid water in there, this electron transport chain expands. And just a few angstroms, which is the tiniest measurement you could ever think of, just a few angstroms difference between two of those proteins, the electrons jump and they don't make it. And that's wasted energy. Okay, so that's how important structured water is. I always think of when I was playing Mario as a kid, and I was like, boing, and I don't make it, and I fall right down. That's the electrons not getting passed down. Okay, so incredibly important. We're going to talk about how we do that, how we shrink those electron transport chains. But one other thing I want to point out, one other way that the heart prevents cancer is that, this is one of the things the heart taught me, the heart emits an electromagnetic field 5,000 times stronger than the brain. That's because of those mitochondria, because mitochondria produce magnetism. And so since it's so dense in mitochondria, you can pick up this field with a meter 8 feet away. And so you'd think that the electrical organ, the brain, would have the most electromagnetic field, but it's the heart. And so that electromagnetic field, remember, structured water needs radiant energy. And this is it's almost like the heart is providing its own radiant energy. However, we can get into a situation where the wrong type of electromagnetic fields, ones that are not compatible with our physiology, can affect the heart. And these authors here in this study, I like that they mentioned down here on the side, irregular structure in myocardial cells. So the wrong type of electromagnetic fields, or too much of them, can affect the ability of the heart to structure structure the water in those heart cells. Okay, so now more practical stuff. We did all the science stuff. Hopefully you're coming along with me here. But yeah, so these are the heart cancer stats. Why would we worry about this? The heart's pretty much got it covered. But like I said, this gives us the template for how we prevent cancer in the rest of the body. So let's talk about how we can do that. So remember, structured water, we need water, a hydrophilic surface, and radiant energy. And that radiant energy, a large part of what it does is it helps us create that electron flow down the electron transport chain. Think electricity, really, electrons, electricity. We are just as much electrical beings as we are anything else. So let's talk about the recipe for how we can create these three things and make sure the water in our body stays structured. So first of all, water. We need the raw ingredient, right? So hydration. People think about just drinking water, drinking enough water. We're told 8 cups a day, all these things. I'm not sure where that came from, but the quality of the water is very, very important. So remember, we talked about how the cells like to stay evenly spaced, and to do that, they need hydrated ions of minerals. And so your water should always have minerals dissolved in it. That's the way it comes out of natural springs. It comes mineralized. And so even if you're filtering your water to make it toxin-free, because toxins interfere with the ability of water to structure itself, especially glyphosate, which is the herbicide found in Roundup. There's actually research that shows that it decreases the structuring of water. But if we, filter our water, that's great. We want to add minerals back to it. And the water rock will structure itself around the minerals. And so then we want to structure it or energize it. People say like, oh, I'm drinking structured water, but I don't necessarily like putting it that way because if you were drinking structured water, you'd be like eating Jell-O. It'd be in a gel state. So really, we're drinking energized water, water that holds energy so that when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, it can structure itself. And so there's different things that people use to structure water. Think of a natural stream. And, the water's flowing over the rocks, or it's vortexing around the rock, it flows past the rock and it creates a little eddy. Like those types of things structure water. That's what energizes water, and that's natural flowing water. So it makes sense that that would be an energized state. But even coming deep out of the earth, the water coming out of those natural springs is very energized and structured from the earth itself. But then most people are dealing with water coming out of their tap, right? So that's not an ideally structured or energized water, but there are devices we can use like this wand here. Has been shown in many studies that if you swirl your water with that wand, it structures itself. There's devices you can use, like whole water filtration systems that you can use. But those are pricey. The things that most people can do is put minerals in the water and swirl it around. Energize that water a little bit. That's the easiest way to create some structure in your water. And there's different levels of doing that. But then also just natural spring water. If you can harvest water from a spring, it's a great idea. So yeah. Hydration, got that one covered. So then we want to prevent cellular fermentation, okay? And this is all about metabolic health, which is a lot of, the topic around KetoCon and low-carb diets. So just some strategies, kind of a hit list to improve metabolic health and prevent cellular fermentation. So exercise, specifically, weight training and high-intensity interval training are better at creating metabolic health. In my opinion. An air filter, different toxin exposures can definitely decrease the amount of structured water we can get. So then we want to avoid toxins and chemicals in general. Got to put air filter on its own because air is not something we can really control, but we can control the air in our homes. So we should do that as much as we can. Avoid artificial sweeteners. They've definitely been shown to, create insulin resistance and poor metabolic health because they kind of keep you in that sweet taste. Your body's expecting something sweet, so it has the same physiology in that process. We want to minimize what's called endotoxemia, which is just when certain bacteria get into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there, and that can happen from poor dental health or poor gut health. We want to get enough mineral salt. Plenty of evidence showing that not enough minerals, not enough salt leads to insulin resistance, poor metabolic health, or can contribute to it. Get enough sleep. That's huge. Don't be sedentary in general. Like even if you're not, working out 3 times a week or whatever every day, at least don't be sedentary. Get up, move your body. Intermittent fasting. I think the early window is better. It's more in the circadian window. Eat when the sun's up, but definitely going to stimulate metabolic health. Reduce your stress. This is a killer. Stress can drive insulin resistance. If your body's stressed, it's not thinking about anything else besides getting rid of that stress, and so it shuts down everything else, including metabolism. And then diet, that's a big one. That's one that's talked about a lot here. So avoid the seed oils, avoid excess fructose, processed grains, processed sugars. Those things are just going to lead to very, very poor metabolic health. And then ketones, remember? Non-fermentable fuel source. So if we don't ever want to go into fermentation in the cell, we want to have ketones around to give your cells an option as a non-fermentable fuel source. But if they're not there, if we never get into a state where we're making ketones, even if we're not in full ketosis, we want to be in a state where we're at least making some ketones. That's metabolic health to me. Very important for preventing this fermentation. So that's that one. And then electron transport chain or electron flow. So this is all about quantum biology, is what the term is, or biophysics. I like that term better. But it's all about gaining electrons from your environment. Remember, food is only one way that you gain energy. If you put your body in the right environment, it will gain energy from a lot of different places. And this is all proven science. And so it's crazy to me that it's been so ignored, and that there is so much focus on food, because when we try and get all of our energy from food, we end up getting too many calories. We should be getting it from other places. And so if someone has gone on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet, or they've tried fasting and they've either seen some improvement and stalled, or they saw no improvement, it just wasn't working for them, this is the slide for them, because that suggests leptin resistance. And these are strategies of how you can correct leptin resistance, which is the precursor to insulin resistance, which then leads to diabetes. So this is your slide. I'm just going to highlight a few of these here. So infrared light, incredibly important. And infrared light is highest at sunrise and sunset. And so watching the sunrise or being outside at sunrise and sunset is incredibly important for energizing water in the body. And you're going to see why in just a minute. It also helps you optimize your circadian rhythm, which is incredibly balancing for the autonomic nervous system. Cold exposure, you want to talk about shrinking that electron transport chain and making sure that electrons can jump. Cold exposure will help you increase the amount of brown fat you use and help you do that. Sunlight in general is super, super important. We've been taught the sun is bad for us, that it causes skin cancer, but that is not the case. It's more likely that the toxic sunscreens and things we put on our skin are driving skin cancer. And sunlight is incredibly beneficial to us. Let's see, reduce blue light. So as I stare at these blue lights here, so blue light nature never designed blue light to be on its own. It's always supposed to have other color frequencies or color temperatures with it. And so these days we have all these artificial lights, these processed lights. It's just like a processed food. A vegetable oil is a very processed, it's one nutrient out of one food. It's a very processed thing. These are processed lights. And they ramp up our sympathetic nervous system, but they also decrease the ability to take energy in from your environment. Grounding is probably the most important thing I think that I'll talk about today. Grounding is if you put your feet directly in contact with the earth, you are a conductive surface, the earth is the conductive surface, and almost instantaneously electrons will start to transfer from the earth into your body, because lightning is striking around the earth thousands of times every day, and it's charging the earth, and we can soak up that energy, and those electrons will travel through us to our cells, and they'll be passed down the electron transport chain to make ATP, which is just astounding. We're so divorced from the earth. You know, we always have shoes on, there's concrete everywhere. Get outside, put your feet on the earth. There's studies, amazing studies about the benefits of grounding. And then a high-fat, metabolically flexible diet. The most important thing about that as far as gaining electrons is that, especially animals, DHA, the fatty acid DHA, is essential for us to be able to take energy from sunlight, and convert it to electrons. And so if we don't have enough DHA because we're not eating enough animal foods, and we replace them with the plant fats, the vegetable oils and other plant fats, then we're not able to do this as well. So DHA is incredibly important. So that's why that higher fat diet is really important. And then I want to talk about infrared sauna, because in our modern world, we need some other therapies. We need some more, intense therapies to offset the modern world that's incompatible with some of these things. And so in Dr. Gerald Pollack's book, who's one of the lead researchers on structured water, and there are many of them, there's Gilbert Ling and James Clegg and Mei-Wan Ho. There's lots of different researchers that have been researching water for a long time. They found, in Pollack's lab, they found that the wavelength of light most absorbed by water is the 3,000 nanometer wavelength of infrared light, okay? And that's more on the far infrared spectrum. I think that, obviously nature, the sunrise and sunset, gives you full spectrum infrared, which is nice, but in the modern world, I like to get a more concentrated dose of the most absorbed by water, which is why I like far infrared. But I'm never going to tell you not to get in a full spectrum or a near infrared sauna, because that's super beneficial as well. But this is me in my relaxed far infrared sauna, which they have a booth over there. I use this, pretty much, 5-6 times a week, trying to get that dose of energy that creates structured water. So that's the electron flow. So just to summarize, cancer of the heart is one of the rarest cancers. This is in large part due to the unique metabolism of the heart combined with the inability of the heart cells to divide. The presence and preference of ketones seems to be protective metabolically and biophysically for the heart. And electrolytes, a metabolically flexible diet, and optimizing electron transport chain electron flow can help maintain proper cell structure and function and prevent disease. So what's the take home for you? Understanding why the heart is resistant to a certain pathology is just as important as understanding why it commonly gets another pathology. And like I said, it lays the template for how we prevent cancer in the rest of the body. This gives us new insights into heart metabolism, preventing heart disease, and creating overall health. So we want to eat in a way that keeps ketones around, expose your body to radiant energy, sunlight, use your sauna, and keep your body in an electromagnetically appropriate environment. We want to ferment your food. So if you talk to Bill Schindler, he'll tell you to ferment your food and all the best ways to do that. But we don't want to ferment our cellular fuel. We want to stay away from that, and ketones and fatty acids are the way that we can do that. We want to optimize our water and mitochondria through sunlight, a proper circadian rhythm, grounding, infrared sauna, etc. So I've been looking into the heart for a long time, and I wrote this book about the heart. And one thing I talk about is why heart cancer is so rare and what we can learn from that. But I just want to kind of go through real quick and tell you what else I talk about in this book. I talk about the evolutionary origins of heart disease. I talk about fourth phase water in other contexts besides cancer, as far as the cardiovascular system as a whole. I talk about how the heart is not the main mover of blood, which there's plenty of evidence that it's not, and what that means for our understanding and treatment of things like heart failure, which is blamed on a heart not pumping blood. I talk about what the true function of the heart is. If it's not to move blood, then what does it do? I talk about atherosclerosis as clotting and not an accumulation of cholesterol, because when we analyze atherosclerosis, we don't find much cholesterol there. We find clotting fibrotic tissue. I talk about cholesterol and statin drugs. That's the biggie that everybody wants to hear about. I talk about metabolic heart attacks, which are heart attacks that occur more frequent than we think, with no blockage whatsoever, and how that can happen. And it has to do with the metabolic reasons that heart cancer is so rare as well. I'll talk about high blood pressure, what I think creates that, the true heart-healthy diet. I talk about the best biomarkers for heart disease, because we're way too focused on cholesterol and we're ignoring others. I talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is very largely ignored when it comes to heart health, and it's a driver of heart disease. There's a reason we say things like, I love you with all my heart, or I gave it all my heart, because we have this emotional connection to the heart. And if we have an improper, relationship with our emotions, that can severely affect the autonomic nervous system and affect our heart in a negative way. I talk about chiropractic and heart health. I am a chiropractor, so I talk about that. I talk about dental health and heart health. And I talk about the heart attack I had at age 34, which shocks a lot of people. I've spent a lot of time researching the heart, and I have a kind of a relationship with my heart. And you could say that it betrayed me. But I like to think that it woke me up and led me in a different path and showed me that I wasn't doing everything that I should be doing. And I talk more about why I think that happened to me on my YouTube channel and what I learned from it, not only from the event itself, but my care in the hospital afterwards and how I disagree with much of it and how I managed that. I talk about that in the book and then on my YouTube channel as well. So that's it. I hope that you learned something and can take some things from it. I think I have a few minutes for questions, so according to this thing. So.
Do you know about Frank Chester and the thinking that the heart is a vortex?
Yeah,
Or
like
structured
I
water?
talk about that in the
Do you
book
think-
too, and how
do
it
you think-
structures water. That's one of the main roles of the heart, and how it's a chestahedron, like he talks about it. Yeah,
I love that.
yeah.
Can you use just a simple frothing device to energize water?
Well, that wand I showed in that picture is kind of that thing. You just kind of use the wand and swirl it around. I guess you could consider it frothing. But that company has a lot of research that shows that it increases the cohesiveness of water, which is what energizing water does. Is it creates cohesiveness to the molecules, so that when they get next to that hydrophilic surface, they can rearrange themselves and become structured water. So, I mean, that's what water does when it's flowing in a river. Like you see rapids, that's creating energy in the water. When it flows past a rock and it swirls, it's what the heart is doing. It's vortexing and spiraling blood, which is water and blood. It's what water's, when it comes from the earth, it's what it's doing. And so there are devices that we can use in our homes when we have this, poor quality water coming out of our tap. We can filter it, we can remineralize it, and then we can energize it. Yes, with some of these. And even just, like I said, swirling the water around in the glass, if you get like a bowl like wine glass, you can swirl it better. That will do some structuring. And then there's different levels of things that you can do to it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. What's the two questions? Can you reverse arthrosclerosis, and what's the best
Wait,
way to do
can
it?
I reverse what?
Arthrosclerosis, the plaque buildup?
Well, I would say yes, mainly because I've seen it happen in people. Lots of people will tell you no, but I've seen CAC scores, coronary artery calcium scores, where there's calcified plaque in arteries. I've seen people reduce those scores. I've seen people, get angiograms of the coronary arteries and reduce the levels of atherosclerosis. So I would say absolutely yes. The talk I gave last year at KetoCon, I talk a lot about the lining of the artery and how to keep that healthy. It also involves structured water, because the lining of an artery is a biological surface, and structured water forms on it because the blood is more than half water. So that's one way we can protect it. And so when we look at things like infrared light, which comes from the sun, or we can get concentrated doses in saunas, that increases the structured water in the lining of the arteries, and that protects it. Remember, it's exclusion zone, so things can't get to it. Right? So if we have intact structured water on the lining of the artery, it's protective. And we see in all the studies with infrared sauna that it increases the health of the endothelium, and it increases nitric oxide production, which is where endothelia, the lining of the arteries, is where nitric oxide is produced. So yes, I would say yes. And then we want other things too, like vitamin K and things like that. Make sure we have enough of those vitamins that take the calcium away and deposit it where it needs to go. And then all the different things that cause inflammation to the lining, we want to stop that, so that the body can heal itself, because it's only going to heal itself if we put it in the right environment. We just have to put it in the right environment.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. You talked about the harmful effects of non-native EMFs, and I got an EMF meter and was very upset to see that even when I put my cell phone in airplane mode, it still was emitting the EMFs. And I just would love for you to share some of those bigger sources of EMFs that would be helpful to stay away from.
Yeah,
or
for
how
sure.
to protect ourselves a little more.
Yeah, we carry one around all the time, our cell phones, and it's I think they call it the reverse square law. So like this is way more detrimental than just this, right? So it's literally like so much less EMF just from putting it here. So always put your phone in speaker mode or speakerphone, and then Wi-Fi. Obviously, our lives are driven by these electromagnetic fields. Sometimes we can't even do our jobs or function without them in today's world. So it's not about freaking out about, what you can't get rid of. It's about reducing your exposure when you can. So like I said, hold your phone away. Don't put your phone in your pocket, put it somewhere else. Turn off your Wi-Fi at night. When no one's using it, there's no reason to have it on. Be conscious of smart devices and things always sending signals. Like she said, you turn your phone in airplane mode. That's great for a plane, but it's still got location services on it, so it's still sending out some signals. You can turn those off in settings, or just turn the phone off completely. There's lots of different things you can use to just reduce your exposure, because unless you live in the middle of nowhere and there's no cell towers around, there's no antennas, anything, you're not going to be not exposed to it. But the other thing is that grounding has been shown to, it's almost like the electrons are coming into you and they're pushing away bad electromagnetic field, because the electromagnetic field of the Earth is the most compatible with us. And so if we're standing on the Earth, we're getting that good energy from that. It almost protects us somewhat from those bad EMFs coming in. Thank you.